Well, hello and welcome to Political Tours and to this second day of our US election tour, where we're looking at Philadelphia. If Donald Trump has the upper hand in rural Pennsylvania, it's Philadelphia that helps give the Democrats the edge in this state. There's a lot to talk about this evening, from voter turnout and Trump's own allegations of electoral fraud. As we saw yesterday, there's a looming fight over how votes may be counted. We're also going to be focusing on the African-American vote, which after a tumultuous summer has arguably been riled up more than ever before. In a moment, we're also going to be joining Malcolm Brown, our correspondent, who at the moment is in central Philadelphia. Just a quick hello to Malcolm. Hello, Malcolm.
Hey, Nick.
How are you doing? But before we're going to go over to Malcolm, we're going to talk with Professor Dave Swenson, who is in Iowa, and he's going to go through some of the stats that explain why Philadelphia is so crucial. Dave.
Well, hello, everybody. We're going to go through some election slides right now. Excuse me. We're going to go through some opinion slides at first in terms of preferences, and then we're going to look at some of the results. This first slide here is showing the preference of the people who have been polled in Pennsylvania over the course of the last several months. Now, there's just a couple of things that really stand out in this slide. The blue line, of course, is Biden. And you can see that over the course of the summer, all the way through the fall, Biden's support has been rock solid, just flat as could be. Trump's support declined some in July, recovered a little bit. Maybe we get up closer to the conventions, and then started to erode. And so that's where we are with regard to the trend of the polls. Now, these are 538 polls, so they're an average of all of the polls that have come in. And could go to the next slide, please. And you can see this is an example of the slides that, or excuse me, of the polls that come in. They're from various survey organizations. Some of them are high quality. You can see that they're rated D- to BC and other kinds of grades. The range for Biden right now is +3 to +7. These polls, by the way, when they calculate those trends that we just saw, they're rated by virtue of their grading, the size of their sample, and how recent these polls were. And by the way, there was a new poll that came out after this slide was made by Harris organization, and that has Biden up +5, which is smack dab in the middle of this range. Next slide, please.
So Dave, just to talk about, before we come on to this next one, the margin of error is the key thing. So normally the margin of error would be about 2-3 points. What would it be?
Yeah, it would be. It depends on the size of the poll. If the poll is somewhere around 400 or 500, the margin of error is going to be much larger. As the poll size gets up close to 1,000 or 1,200, then the margin of error gets close to 3. And then super large polls, you don't improve your margin of error that much. So that's why poll samples are rarely larger than about 1,200 to 1,300 in the really good polls. In recent years, a lot of the frequent polls will come in at about 800. And that's what they consider their average size for a poll if you're going to be doing them relatively frequently.
We saw this slide yesterday, and it really shows the importance of Philadelphia here, doesn't it?
Exactly right. The Philadelphia County, this is weighted by the number of votes by party or by candidate in 2016. And it shows you the degree to which Philadelphia really weighed in. 85% of the voters chose Hillary Clinton, about 85%. And then the degree of blue tells you the proportion, the strength of that county. That's also organized from top left to lower right, from the largest proportion to the smallest proportions. You can see down in the lower right county, though, or right counties, lower right corner, those smaller counties, many of them went from 75 to 85% Trump. So you can see the degree of polarization between the mostly larger counties and the upper left quadrant angle, and then the mostly smaller counties in the lower right quadrant.
Okay.
Next slide, please. Now, this slide we also, I think, looked at last night, but it shows you each of the counties, and it also by the size of the circle. If it's pink, or if that's a pink color on your screen, that went Republican. If it's blue, of course, it's Democrat. And then the size of the circle tells you by how many votes they went one direction or the other. And you can see, if you look at the large circles at the bottom, Clinton's margin in and around that entire southeastern part of Philadelphia, the broader metropolitan area, was plus 634,500. But over the rest of Pennsylvania, Trump was 808,000. Allegheny County over to the west is where Pittsburgh is. They came in at plus 105,000 and change. But the rest of the blue counties just really didn't add enough to come anywhere close to overcoming that massive advantage that Trump had. And if you look, the thing that stands out for me, if you look at the center of the state to Center County, that's where Penn State University is. And normally you would see in a university county a larger margin for Democrats. So there was a lot of weakness demonstrated among the Democrats in this graph. And I can give you just a real quick statistic that just really sums it up. In 2016, Clinton drew 64,000 fewer voters in total than Obama did in 2012. Trump drew 290,000 more voters than Romney did in 2012. And the absolute value of the difference between those two is 354,000. And Obama had won by 310,000. So you can see that they just did not have enough margin at all to make up that difference. If we go to the next slide, please. Here we're looking at how important the city of Philadelphia within Philadelphia County is. Now, these are the wards in which at least 75% of the people were African American. So these are heavily minority populated wards, traditionally strong voters for Democrats. In these wards, last election, Trump got about 31% more votes than Romney. So his performance in those wards was significantly better than Romney, while Clinton got 7% fewer votes than Obama did in 2017. So you can just see the shifting that was going on, even in a place that should have been rock solid Democrat.
Well, I think we can see you. We're going to, in a moment, we're going to be going to Malcolm, where we're going to be seeing, I think, a very different environment to 2016, already a significant indication that the votes, the turnout in Philadelphia is going to be substantially up on last time. Let's just go to the next slide. And this is obviously the big controversy, isn't it, Dave? What's going to happen to those votes once they're being counted?
Yeah, this is really a good cartoon. By the way, Signa Wilson is a Pulitzer-winning cartoonist, quite well respected. But think about it. On the left side is that orderly process, to the degree that it's orderly, of engaging in your civic duty. And then on the other side is the impending or implied chaos that perhaps we have to look forward to as we move through this electoral process.
Well, great. Thank you very much for that, Dave. That was really useful. I think in a moment, as I say, we're going to join Malcolm. But just before we do that, I want to remind everyone with a clip from Donald Trump from the only presidential debate that took place. And this is when he mentioned Philadelphia and had voting in Philadelphia specifically within his site. So let's just bring that clip up now. May take us a second or so just to line it up. There we go.
As you know, today there was a big problem. In Philadelphia, they went in to watch. They're called poll watchers, a very safe, very nice thing. They were thrown out. They weren't allowed to watch. You know why? Because bad things happen in Philadelphia, bad things. And I am urging my people. I hope it's going to be a fair election. If it's a fair election, I am 100% on board. But if I see tens of thousands of ballots being manipulated, I can't go along with that. And I'll tell you what,
does that mean,
from a common sense,
does that mean you're going to tell your people to take to the street?
It means you have a fraudulent election.
Well, the debate has already been raging. There have been cases going on in the Supreme Court about voting there, and the cases within Pennsylvania. But the best person to cover all of this is Malcolm, who's in downtown Philly at the moment. Malcolm, just tell us what you've been doing today. What's the situation there?
Wandering around, just getting a feel for some of the neighborhoods and, you know, all the kind of visible signs that you tend to see. And the dominant sign that I'm seeing around some of the neighborhoods is a sign that encourages people to vote, but also make a plan, which is not a kind of motif that I've seen in previous elections. And that's really a symbol of the complexity of what voters are being asked to do in this particular election race. There are all these new systems nationally and locally here specifically, and people are being asked to navigate that. And then there's all this doubt, even as they may have settled on the plan to use their option for a postal ballot, then Donald Trump is out there undermining confidence, not only in the postal system, but in the whole process, and threatening that he'll challenge it in the courts. And so a lot of people, it appears, anecdotally, at least I can say, have been receiving postal ballots, but on occasion deciding that they're actually going to bring it in person. So this whole make a plan thing is very important. You really have to have a plan. You know, you've got a series of options. You could decide you're going to return your mail-in ballot in the mail and do it super early, and there's plenty of indication that that's happening. Around here, for instance, the state has issued, I think, 2.8 million paper ballots, and they would receive, the latest figure I saw, which is maybe a day or two old, about 20% of those back already, which seems like a pretty fast return of paperwork. So that's interesting, that's going on, and that's really the issue here. People are having to change their normal patterns of voting and really decide how they're going to do this. There's a political calculation, and then there's a public health calculation, which is a new component to all of this. So it just adds to the anxiety of what's already a really pretty difficult election already.
So you've been able to get out and about and look at some of the polling stations, and also speak to some, at least one political analyst as well. So let's just see what you've been doing and get a sort of closer understanding of what's going on at the polling stations. We're just going to bring up your first report now. Yeah, here we go.
Okay, so we're here in Philadelphia, outside an early voting site. You'll see behind me. This is a place that, as a Philadelphia resident, you can come, you can apply for a ballot, receive the ballot, and vote all in one go. And people are queuing up on a really pretty wet Friday after morning here in Philadelphia to do that. And among them is Tara, who you're here to vote, presumably, is that right?
Absolutely, yes, I am.
Okay. Is this the way you normally vote? Because I know the rules have changed a little in Philadelphia, right?
No, not at all. We usually go to our regular voting place, but because we can come out and vote early, I'm coming out and voting early, even in the rain.
And you and your friends and the people you know, is that like a common thought?
No, not really. Not really. We usually go out to our normal voting locations, right. But because of the COVID and because of everything that's going on.
Oh no, I mean this time around, is everybody thinking the same way?
I'm thinking so, yes.
Okay, and yes. Then you don't have to answer this, but do you mind if I ask you who you're going to vote for?
Absolutely Biden.
Okay, and are you enthused about him?
Absolutely, yes.
Okay. Are you a traditional Democrat?
Absolutely, yes.
Okay. Do you think he's going to win?
Absolutely, yes.
Okay, so there we go. That's a sense of what's happening here in Philadelphia on this wet Monday. Numbers seem pretty high. The state has sent out most of its mail ballots already, and they're coming back in pretty large numbers. The most recent number I saw, 20% of the postal ballots that have been distributed have already been returned. So the signs are at this stage that enthusiasm's really pretty high.
So a couple of things to add to that report. I spoke to a local organizer who was encouraging people to register and vote. The opportunity to register is just about to close for people in Philadelphia. But he said he'd been outside that polling place since it opened on the 13th. And he said that the line had been going down the street for the days prior to today. And obviously those numbers may have been knocked down a bit by today's pretty dreadful weather here in Philadelphia. But generally speaking, the turnout already looks to be high. And the whole issue of turnout was something that I spoke to Professor Robin Kolodny, who's a political science professor at Temple University, which is right where that polling place is. And she said that the changes in the rules about how people can vote, they've removed the requirement. Absentee ballots require some form of excuse, like I'm going to be out of town on election day. So it's now much easier to cast a postal ballot. That plus the enormous interest in this election are really driving up numbers. And she generally thinks, Professor Kolodny thinks, that's going to be good news for Biden.
Nationally, Robin, we've had, we understand, 17 million plus votes already cast.
Yes.
We've got handfuls of people here looking to cast their vote imminently. How unusual is this kind of early turnout?
Well, for us, it's completely unusual because the law changed in 2019. So previously, if you'd been here 2 years ago or 4 years ago, this wouldn't have been possible. But our laws changed to make it easier to vote early and to get what we call a no excuse absentee ballot. So it used to be that you have to say a reason, I won't be in the district, for example, on election day. No longer. Now, any reason, and especially COVID has made the cities and the counties across the state want to go ahead and build these satellite offices. It's not just for voting, by the way, it's also for people who still need to register to vote, which they can do until Monday here. And they can also get a mail-in ballot if they want to take it home. But my bet is that most people, if they're standing in line at this point, are also going to vote here today.
Now, one spin-off from all of this is that we have systems that are novel, people who are not necessarily used to the systems, and a climate in which there could be legal disputes and fights about this. How concerned are you about that end of things?
Oh, I'm not concerned about this at all. Unfortunately, I think that it's something that rankles a bit with those of us who are not only residents here, but I happen to be a machine operator at my polling location. So I've been trained to do a particular task there, and I'm there when the polls open, I'm there when the polls close, and I know all the procedures that the state does, and I just don't see what, the only way you find a problem is if you wish for one to be there. Now, it's clear that what President Trump did is made an assumption back in 2016 based on voting in the city in 2012 for Mitt Romney versus Barack Obama. So the issue is we're standing here in North Philadelphia, which is not a very rich area. And there were precincts in this area where not a single person cast a vote for Mitt Romney. The president decided that meant that there must have been fraud. Well, let me back up and tell you that 87% of the city's residents register as Democrats and 13% register as Republicans. We have 1,700 polling places in the city of Philadelphia. It's not implausible, given those numbers, to think that that could happen. But that's really the basis of his concern. That, and he would like to have some contestable way if Pennsylvania ends up being close. That's what I think, unfortunately, this is all about. Because the reality is, and here what's different for us is there's not a national set of policies or even a national ballot. Every state sets it up. But this state, like every other state, changed things since 2016 in reaction to the allegations that the Russians were hacking into our systems or doing. So in this state right now, every polling location has to have, or every county, every jurisdiction, has to have a paper trail for the ballot. So what has happening now is we've gone back to some basics. And people here will bubble in a sheet that will be scanned, and then it goes into a container somewhere else. And then those at the end of the night are stored for 3 years in the municipality, so that if somebody comes back and says, I think there's been an issue at this polling location, then we can say, here are the actual ballots, let's review it. And that's why I'm saying I've spent hours trying to reconcile one number. 89 people signed in on our book, 88 votes on the machine. And that's actually something that can happen because of something known as a fleeing voter. That is somebody who takes a ballot, but for whatever reason, doesn't turn it in. And that happens a fair amount, actually, but just takes one to make all of us a little crazy.
The interesting thing about that polling location, I should point out a couple of things. In fact, one, this was one of the locations that the Trump campaign went to court over. They were trying to get observers in there. Locals or Democrats cried foul, suspected attempts at voter intimidation. That was knocked back by the court because the rules governing that kind of polling place are different from a polling place on election day, it transpires. The other point I spoke to Professor Kolodny about was the whole importance of Philadelphia, which we've heard about from Dave at the top. But she pointed out that even though Hillary Clinton won massively in Philadelphia last time around, she won much less massively than Barack Obama. And she is convinced that Joe Biden is a kind of a favorite son. He comes from this region, and that's really going to help him here. And she really points out, she hammered home the point with me in another section of the interview that we're about to play about the importance of Philly. She really fleshed that out.
Right, the polls suggest, I think the Real Clear Politics average for Pennsylvania is about 6+% for Biden. So just above the margin of error.
Yes.
So how do you see the current state of the race here, and what are the key factors to watch?
Well, I'm going to tell you one of the key factors is right behind me, because the old adage what James Carville said about us years ago is true, is that Pennsylvania is a rural state, Alabama, he said, between two cities. The cities are here, Philadelphia and Pittsburgh. Philadelphia is by far the largest city in this state, and the counties that surround it are also the most populous. So this corner of the state is critical. And I will tell you right now that Biden will be above those numbers, maybe considerably, if turnout in this city is like this. And that's the key, because when Hillary Clinton campaigned here in 2016, she came out of Philadelphia with a margin of 455,000 votes. Now remember that Trump beat her by 44,000 votes, but Obama had gotten almost 500,000 extra votes, right? So if you take away what the Republican got, if she had hit that,
so this is where you need to come as a Democrat to harvest as many votes as you can, basically. Absolutely. Right? That's to counteract exactly right. Places like we were yesterday in Luzerne County, yes. Where Dems are hopeful that they'll do better than last time. They're confident they'll do better than last time. They don't know if they'll get over the line in Luzerne. They'd love to, obviously, but it's to counteract those places, right?
Precisely, because there are much less dense population in the rest of the state. And by the way, let's not forget our friends in Pittsburgh. All right, so Pittsburgh is a smaller city, but still has very similar dynamics to Philadelphia. And so a good turnout in Pittsburgh and a good turnout in Pennsylvania can negate good turnout in the rest of the state. The problem in 2016 was that some of these areas near Luzerne County had higher than expected, or historic even, levels of turnout in those rural areas. And it wasn't that turnout in Philadelphia was bad, it was just not as high as it could be. I mean, there are places in this city that will have 90% turnout, which means, by the way, because we have no way in our system to take a dead person off the rolls, that literally everybody but the dead people, or the people who've moved out, are the ones that don't turn out. I mean, it's really compelling when that happens. And that is where, if we're in the rest of the U.S., and I'm sure in Luzerne you have almost non-existent or weak unions, that's not the case here. And in most large cities, anywhere, but especially in the eastern coast of the U.S., the unions can be very, very effective at organizing, get out the vote. And this ability to do early voting is a gift to them, because that's a 2.5 week window instead of a 1 day.
So the key takeaways from all of that, turnout already looks to be pretty high. In a city where 80+% of registered voters are registered Democrats, that really has got to be seen as good news for the Democrats and the Biden campaign. But someone with a much better insight into Philadelphia politics than me is about to join us. Anton Moore is heads up ward, the 48th ward, I think. Is that right, Anton? In Philadelphia.
Mighty.
Well, thank you for making time for joining us. It's very good of you. So give us your take. Well, where is this what's going on? What's on your mind as voting already takes place? And I keep telling our audience here that this isn't an election that's about to happen. It's very much underway. So what are your thoughts right now?
My thoughts is we got to keep our feet on the pedal. We can't get caught up in the polls, the numbers. I feel like in 2016, we got caught up in the numbers. Everybody was relaxed. Hillary's leading in the polls. It's going to be all right. It's going to be this big celebration on election day. And boom, Donald Trump became president. So we're doing what we can in our ward. Next week, we're having a get on a bus initiative in which we're having like a party with DJs. We're going to have some food. And 5 sections within my ward, we're going to have a bus going around, taking people to early polling sites so they can drop off their ballots and fill out for a mail-in ballot and do different things. But we want to make sure we be proactive and actually keep our foot on the pedal when it comes to the election, because people are excited. People are watching. As you can see last night, Joe Biden had more of an audience than Donald Trump. That tells you something. And when you look at the polls, it's all starting to coincide together. So I'm excited.
Anton, your guy right from the start, or did you have your eye on someone else?
I always thought about Joe Biden because I had a good working relationship with the Obama campaign, and I did a lot with them. So, I was always like looking, but I seemed to always lean to Joe Biden. But once he won South Carolina, I said, game over. We looked at the candidates and said, who can actually win this in the long run? And Biden's name kept pushing, and it goes well with the African-American audience in my community.
Now, this may just be a Republican talking point, who knows? But, it did come up in that town hall last night. Biden has a long Senate career. There are some decisions that he's made that probably don't play. They haven't aged well, I guess, with the African-American community, like the whole criminal justice bill in the mid-1990s. Does that still linger, or is that just a Republican talking point?
That's a Republican talking point that they stole from a disgruntled Democrat who looks like Joe Biden. Here's the thing. If you go back to the crime bill, during that time, violence was very high in the cities. There was a lot of drug use and different things like that. And it was actually African-Americans from, the United States that said, look, we need to do something. When you live in the inner city and you see bodies dropping, you're looking for answers. And Joe Biden put up a bill that wasn't perfect. But if you look at America, what is perfect? You know what I mean? So him doing that and that happening, it's two sides of that. You know what I mean? Because at the end of the day, when there's a lot of crime and different things going on, you're going to need some type of law and order going on to actually fix some of this. So when I look at that, maybe they could have tweaked some things, but that's in the past. We look into the future, and we want to get Donald Trump out of office.
Okay, Anton, can I step in here? It's Nicholas here. The Black Lives Matter protests and the events of the summer have really seized people's attentions around the world. And it's no doubt in my mind that your community must be turning out in larger numbers because of that. Can you just talk a bit about the resonance to people? But also I'm interested can you understand that on the Republican side, how they're trying to play that, how they're trying to see that as a threat?
They see it as a threat because when you hear Donald Trump say, stand back and stand by, you know what that means. Stand back for a second, but be on standby ready to go when I tell you. When he talks about law and order, we understand what that means in the African-American community. So when he doesn't denounce, the national group, that's against African-Americans, and in that speaking racial tone, the African-American community kind of understands what direction Donald Trump is going in. So when we look at the Black Lives Matter movement and what's going on, that's energizing the base to get ready, to get things done, to vote, because we need to see change now. And let me be clear. When you look at Democrats, they're on the timetable as well, because yes, we're going to vote for Joe Biden, but they're on the clock to bring about change because Philadelphia is ranked number 2 in big cities in deep poverty. So we need to see some change on the ground. Our schools are bad. The gun violence is bad. Poverty level is high. So we have to show some results. So we're pushing this ticket of Joe Biden, but we got to make sure when Joe Biden assumes office in January, that we hold him accountable as well.
Yeah. Okay. Malcolm, let's just look ahead. So the big equation here in Philadelphia really it's about Pennsylvania. It's about rural versus the urban vote. Do you remember going back to Dante Cini, the different categories we were talking about? So let's just look ahead to next week, and we're going to be heading to Fairfax County, which is just outside Washington, and then Fauquier County. So just give us some of the ideas of the what we're going to be looking ahead, the different battles that we're looking at there.
Yeah, this is in Dante's wordology. I think it's the suburbs versus the exurbs. But basically, you know, Fairfax County, you drive west out of Washington, D.C., you cross the river, you're into Virginia, and sort of imperceptibly you're in Fairfax County. It's just a sort of spread. It's like the agglomeration around lots of major cities, London, etc. So you're in Fairfax County. It's very densely populated. And it's over the years got more and more democratic, and because of its major population size, it's helped to turn Virginia purple, is generally the way it's regarded, and increasingly democratic. Drive just 30 minutes, keep going, just 30 minutes down the road, and you get to Fauquier County. Looks relatively similar, not quite as densely packed, bigger houses, bit more land, you know, 5 to 10 acre lots, that kind of thing, much more conservative. So your two areas, sort of suburbs, a suburb and an exurb, pretty close to each other, see the world pretty differently. And so it's going to be interesting to see. I mean, we expect Fairfax to be, you know, a strong democratic base. It's a diverse kind of place. And it's very unlike the picture of the suburbs that Donald Trump has been relying on in this election campaign, where he's been using he's been accused of using dog whistle politics to frighten white voters about some flight of urban minorities coming their way, and he can protect them. That's not the same message that may resonate in Fauquier. It's really not resonating in Fairfax, which is already a pretty multi-ethnic, cosmopolitan kind of place. Okay.
Dave, I'm going to come back to you. Let's and we were presuming that there's going to be a big turnout in Philadelphia. Just thinking, the question we've asked ourselves again and again is about the validity of the polls. They managed to get it wrong last time. How have pollsters changed things since last time?
Well, yes, all of the pollsters, New York Times, 538, all of the polling organizations are paying a lot of attention to not just how they do the polls, but also how they're reporting the results of those polls and or the methods that they're using to aggregate those polls to try to draw some conclusions. They figured out what they were doing wrong, they say, with regard to sampling in the previous polls, whether they were undersampling or oversampling certain groups of people, whether they weren't mixing up landlines and or other kinds of contacts with the voters, how to weight online polls and or whether they should be valid or not valid were also issues that they had to work through. In 2016, they included a lot of online polls in many of their aggregations, and they weren't quite sure, you know, again, how to validate those without absolutely having an idea who the population was that was being polled. You have, for example, when I showed the slide way before the 538 polls, you saw something called SurveyMonkey. Well, you're only doing SurveyMonkey if you're online. And there's a whole lot of people, to include my mom and dad, who are rarely online. And that's probably the case in many of the communities that they're not going to have access. Either the pollsters aren't going to have access to them, or they're not going to have access to opportunities to participate in the poll. So cleaning a lot of that garbage polling was an important part of this. The other part of it was the crow that a lot of pollsters had to eat, because their reputations depend on their ability to produce useful and usable results. And now I'm not talking about the national polls, but the different individual state polls and the conclusions that were drawn. And then the last thing was the messaging. And you asked it right up at the front. Things like the margin of error. How much confidence should we have in these results? And should we be making assertions as to whether a candidate is ahead or not, if statistically they're tied?
Right. And Dave, just as a proof of things, how accurate have those polls been in the midterms and let's say more recent governor's elections? I mean, that Wisconsin, for example, just had a changed governors. You must know how accurate some of those polls have been or not been.
Well, the polls have been more accurate in the last round. In the last round, everything that's happened since 2016 has been for the better. The polls are doing better. I am inclined to have much more confidence in the polls right now, but I'm also inclined to pay attention to the polls because the pollsters are being very specific about what they're polling, where they're polling, and who they're polling, and that there's a lot of polling gaps in places that just, you know, nobody's polling South Dakota, nobody's polling Wyoming. There are lots of places that aren't being polled for strategic reasons because they don't count. They count because we already know how they're going to turn out. So we also still have to pay attention to exactly where the poll is, how many polls there are, and the quality of that poll. We have, again, there's a lot of bad polls out there, and you have to pay attention to the quality of the polls. And unless you're a seasoned analyst, you're not going to know that a Rasmussen leans hard right, or another type of pollster perhaps is almost always leaning to the left. So, you know, learning those ropes is part of the process. And a lot of those emerged during 2016 on up till now.
Okay, we're going to get some comments from some other people. Dave, I want to come back to you in a moment to talk about how accurate you think they are in Pennsylvania and give some kind of prediction. It seems that everyone that Malcolm has been speaking to really does expect Biden to win by a reasonable percentage or several percentage points. So we'll come back to both of you on that in a second. But Lois Towart, you've got a few comments and maybe possibly a question as well. Lois.
Yes, you can hear me?
Yeah, clearly, yeah.
Wonderful, okay. What it is when you talk about using a driver's license as an ID, that tends to favour people in country areas, because having moved from a country area into a big city, the first thing you start meeting is people who cannot drive, because you don't need to drive when you live in a big city. So therefore, the using the driver's license as an ID automatically has flaws because it's starting to preclude people who don't drive, which may be more likely to live in cities. So any form of ID, you've got to start saying, well, actually, are you precluding groups and are they likely to be voting in a particular way? So it gets back to that pollster's bias and everything. You need to start looking at your ID methods and saying, well, okay, that could be a problem there.
Yeah, no, it's very hard. Malcolm, just to come back to what we were saying earlier, I mean, you've been looking around for, you've been asking questions left, right, and center, but just in terms of your straw poll, you haven't been able to find a Republican supporter yet, have you?
No, it's all, I mean, obviously in Luzerne County, you see Republican T-shirts and so on, but no, there's not a lot of visible Republican activity in downtown Philly. I mean, they're devoting their resources elsewhere, and they are devoting resources. I mean, let's not deny the fact that both parties are pouring massive resources. This is the stage of the campaign for the battleground states are just like a black hole for all the money. And the Democrats have raised large amounts of money, more. They're out raising and outspending the Republicans at the moment, which is a source of great concern to Republican backers.
Yeah, there's a group called American Bridge, and we played one of their adverts yesterday, which was the former soldier. And I think they're pushing $310 million worth of advertising, and most of that going into Pennsylvania. So it's a huge amount of firepower, as you say. Ruth Campbell has got a follow-up question on what we were just talking about. Go ahead, Ruth.
Hello, everyone. I'm interested in a comment which we heard from the one of the Republican speakers about whether the polarization of the community means that in a polling situation, people have become reluctant to say what they really, what their intentions really are. And I'm interested in everyone's comments on that.
Dave, I've got to go back to you on that one. It is certainly true. Reluctance. I mean, the key thing is that many people who support Trump just are not polled properly.
That could be the case, and we have the silent Trump people and the hidden voters, and we also have this issue called response bias, where when you answer a question, you don't necessarily reveal your true feelings, because what you're doing is you're revealing what you think might be the more desired response. And nearly everybody who's cognizant of what's been going on understands some of the dynamics and the controversy and the tensions with regard to President Trump, whether you agree with him or not. The pollsters are, again, we get back to this thing. I encourage people to pay attention to the good polls. And when you pay attention to the good polls, you look at the good poll questions, and then you look at the good poll techniques. And the good poll techniques have X number of landline calls, X number of cell phone calls, and different types of methods. And so I worry less about this hidden group. Now, in 2016, we had this issue, though, with regard to this response bias, with regard to people saying, either not saying they were against Hillary Clinton, but still harboring resentments and or deep felt antagonisms and towards that candidate, because it's the bias that pops in. So dealing with that bias is an issue. Measuring how much the bias occurred, though, only occurs during the election. We have the polls up to the point of the election, and then the degree to which that bias occurs is sussed out as they then, first we see the election, and then as they do the post-election investigations, whether it's exit polling or the other kinds of analysis that occur after the election. So might there be some of this going on right now? Of course, there's always some of this going on. Is it widespread? I don't see any evidence to suggest that it could possibly be widespread and skewing the polls.
Okay.
I would also add to that outside polling, just in terms of the polarization of the nation. It's a bit like Brexit in Britain, right? There's a lot of people who just stop talking about politics with people that they don't know. And also I've met people who won't put up yard signs on either side sometimes, just because they don't want to draw down the kind of heat that they think it'll generate. And, I've been in the States 20 plus years, and the level of animosity and antagonism is certainly, in my estimation, the highest that it's been in that time. Yeah.
Okay. Great. I'm going to go back. I think we've got a fifth clip from Robin Kolodny, who was talking about Kamala Harris and also Biden. I think we've spoken a bit about Joe Biden's popularity. I'm not too sure if we've got that clip to hand there. We'll just see if we've got that now. Let's.
So let's talk about the appeal of. We can assume that Donald Trump is not going to win here. I think it's probably fair to assume. Fair, yes. So let's talk about the appeal of his rivals, Joe Biden and Kamala Harris. Presumably picking an African-American woman will appeal to a city that has a very sizable African-American population. But there are some potential issues. It came up last night in the debate here in Philadelphia, the town hall debate that Joe Biden did. He has some baggage from being in the Senate and supporting the crime bill in the 90s, which is controversial in the African-American community, not popular, and he's obviously doing some defense on that. So how do they play as a ticket is my basic question.
Well, so we have a bit of a unique perspective in this city, because I'm not sure if you realize, but 2.5 miles, maybe not even 2.5, dead down the road from us is Biden's national headquarters. So Biden's from Delaware. He's not from Pennsylvania. But he's going to win Delaware, and Wilmington is a much smaller city in comparison. So it made perfect sense. It was very smart for him to come right from the beginning. So he's been employing people. He's been, present for a long time. And in fact, I had a journalist call me just before he announced, so in like March of 2019, and he said, so how do you think Kamala Harris is going to do, or Kristen Gillibrand, who's going to appeal in Pennsylvania? I said, none of them if Biden gets in. He's like, oh, Biden won't get in. I'm like, well, I think Biden will get in. And then Biden got in, and it was hysterical because the polls were showing even support for the rest of the candidates. As soon as Biden went in, it went completely lopsided, 65% support for Biden, because he is considered like a native son. He is from the area. He's never been a stranger here. And I think most voters are willing to forgive something that didn't turn out the way that you intended for other things in his record. And in this city, I think there's not going to be much of a concern The way that Biden talked about race, for example, in the town hall, and the compassion he showed, that is more appealing, I think, than claims that people's lives are better because the current administration is in office, when they look around them and say, I'm waiting for when I'm going to see that.
Great. So I think we'll be wrapping this up shortly. We just need, if anyone's got more questions, please do add them now. We're coming up to the end of the hour. It's clear to us that, you know, Philly's, you know, Democratic heartland. There can't be much debate about it, and we've just got to wait and see what the numbers are. Anton, just before we finish, what are your biggest fears? What are your biggest hopes? What do you think what could go wrong between now and election night?
Well, what could go wrong is a big story drop and everybody gets scared and say, "Oh, we can't vote for Biden. We got to stay with Trump." But it's not going to happen. My biggest thing is I hope that on election night we could declare a winner and the mail-in ballots don't matter.
Right. So it's the size of the majority. That's the key thing. And I think that's a really important thing to say, Malcolm, isn't it? Because this could otherwise be drawn out into a long, complex and horrible process.
Yep.
Yes, and just on that, you are starting, I mean, there are sections of the Republican Party who seem to be implicitly conceding that this is going very badly and heading in that direction. Ben Sasse, who's a senator, who's been no big fan at all of Donald Trump, but he allowed himself to be recorded during a very open call with constituents, being excoriatingly critical of Trump in a way that, to an extent that he hadn't been to this point. And, you know, when you start to see that, that really indicates that some within the Republican Party really see this ending badly for them when they start to finesse their own interests rather than Donald Trump's, because they've been pretty much lockstep with him up to this point. So yes, and in answer to the question, if this is a tidal wave, then obviously a lot of these legal questions and whether there were 2,000 ballots here or there all just go away. And to Anton's point, though, you know, there's very little time for an October surprise. And also, all the votes that have already been cast won't obviously factor that in. So, to an extent, they're now protected from any change to October surprise, you know, factor.
Okay. Well, listen, I think we're gonna wrap it up there. I'm just gonna add one thing. Malcolm and all of us, we've been dealing with quite a few sort of COVID issues with speakers and getting access to things. So it's been a tough challenge. In terms of where you're set up, and that's partly why Malcolm is set up where he is in the middle of the street. But my thanks very much to Malcolm for coping with things in a difficult situation. Thank you very much indeed to Anton Moore for joining us. Do stay on the line because I want you to join in. We've still got Malcolm there, we've still got Dave there, but I'm just going to look ahead to the questions for the discussions we've got next week. So on Monday, we've got Florida, another key swing state. That's with Ryan Tyson, who's a pollster, works largely with the Republican Party, and David Rancourt, who used to be the Secretary of State in Florida, a key Republican person there. So it'll be very interesting to get their views. Then on Tuesday, I don't think we've got a slide for this one, but just on Tuesday, we've got John Kampfner. I'll tell you about that later. He's a very interesting journalist. He's written a book about Germany. We'll come on to that in a bit. And then coming back to our election series, we will be in Fairfax County, as we discussed in the program earlier. That's just outside Washington, D.C. That is leaning Democrat, expected to go Democrat. Again, it's about the turnout there. And then the day after that, we'll be going to Fauquier County, which is more Republican leaning. So we've got a lot to look forward to next week. Please do join us. Stay on the line, everyone, and we'll take some more questions. So Neil Fleming, I can see you there. Neil, can we get your microphone to work? No. No, I can't hear you, Neil. I can't hear you. Are you able to write down? Yes, you've got your question there. So you said, can it be said that in a place like Pennsylvania, Trump has rung that all he could, and that he was unlikely to be able to extend his appeal? That's a really, Malcolm, that's a really hard question, isn't it? There seemed to be movement there in Luzerne County.
Yeah, sorry, there was a bit of commotion out here. Can you just recap the question?
So we were talking about Neil Fleming in Australia was saying it looked like in a place like Pennsylvania, Trump has wrung out all he could and that he was unlikely to be able to extend his appeal. I mean, he has been appealing purely to his base.
Yeah, I mean, the thing about Donald Trump is you pretty much know who he is at this point. There's not a lot of mystery about who he is. And I think most of the experts who look at this tend to assume that his appeal is baked. The numbers, as Dave would tell us, have remained pretty solidly within a narrow and broadly unchanging band. But that's why when we first spoke to Dante Cini, he said that so he's failed largely to draw people in. The strategy around the margins has either been to discourage people from voting and to discourage them from taking part in the process, people who might otherwise oppose him at one end of the scale, peel off a few. And interestingly, Professor Kolodny did point out that he'd been slightly more successful to do that with African-American men than women. The problem with that strategy is that women are much more likely to vote. So that isn't a totally winning strategy for him. Yeah. And at the other end of the scale, there's nowhere else to go. He's sucked up most of the support that he's likely to get. So it becomes a question of mobilizing the troops, who gets out on the day, who you can keep away from the polls on the day. But yeah, it's not so much a persuasive argument, I think, at this point. Most minds, although there are still measurable numbers of independents out there, and you find them who say they still haven't made up their minds. Yeah. So there is a constituency out there. It's just a pretty small one.
And David, the fact that the places like Arizona, even Trump, even Texas being moving into marginal territory, all very, very bad signs for him.
Well, they are, and I'm going to do something else though that we talked about when we were talking with Dante before, is that we have the spatial dynamics of population growth. A lot of what we saw on our previous map in Pennsylvania is not growing or declining. Luzerne County was going down. Philadelphia County is expanding. The surrounding suburbs are growing relatively robustly. And who are the people that are populating those places? In Philadelphia, it's significantly, of course, it's a minority population, both moving in, but in the surrounding, most of the mobile people that are moving to these larger places tend to vote Democratic. They tend to have higher educations. They tend to be younger. And so even in a 4-year period, you can get enough of a shift. What's going on in Arizona? It's had an influx of in-migration over the last decade, 2 decades. California, one of the most rapid growing states in the United States. So we have the dynamics of our heritage of political preferences that is intersecting harshly with migration changes. You can say the same thing about Atlanta and Georgia, and a lot of what's going on in North Carolina as well are all reflecting those kinds of spatial dynamics. And I have to do one thing, and Neil, I don't want to insult you, but the only thing I could think of is your volume turned all the way off on your laptop, because that's one reason you might not be being heard. And so I'm just offering that suggestion.
And I had something to add, which I should have said to Neil. Sorry, Neil. I saw you were talking, but you are still muted, unfortunately. But the one thing, in addition to your point, which I should have mentioned earlier, there are some unique things about Pennsylvania. And the one that comes to mind is the issue of fracking. It's the process for putting oil out of the ground. It's a very, very big deal in Pennsylvania. And it cuts across party lines to some extent, because you've got landowners who make good amounts of money from renting their land for the purpose of fracking. There are wellheads there. There's a huge industry also around fracking. And in an area that's lost so many jobs from the coal industry, you can't afford to lose any more jobs. And so I mention all of this because Trump is going after Biden hard in Pennsylvania, saying that he's a big supporter of the Green New Deal, which is a pretty left-leaning environmental agenda. That's a huge favorite of the progressive wing of the Democratic Party. And they will definitely want payback if and when Biden wins. So he's accusing Biden of wanting to ban fracking. Biden says that's not true, but he does want to prevent fracking on federal property. So he's trying to sort of thread the needle there. And that is a local issue, which even if you don't like Donald Trump, if your job is tied to the fracking industry, you're a blue collar type and you deliver pipe or services to that industry, and you believe Donald Trump, if you do, then that is a problem for you that might cut across traditional party lines. So, you know, there are some margins locally to get into for Trump there.
This is one of those examples. This is one of those examples, though, and this is important, where an issue has political importance disproportionate to its economic importance. The total mining employment in Pennsylvania is just under 28,000. The total the total number of people working in that state is 6.2 million. And so it's a really small fraction of the economy, but it can be a huge political issue, and it's going to resonate out in areas, even though the number of people working in that industry just isn't that great.
That's often the case with sort of emotive traditional forms of industry or agriculture. We could talk about fishing in the UK and how that's playing out in the Brexit debate. It takes on a sort of meaning that's separate from its actual economic value. Neil, is your microphone working? No, it's not. Okay. We have tried. But I think you got some good answers to your question there. Let's bring in Sheila de Belague, because I think the battle, I mean, we've been talking about Philadelphia, it's very urban, but really the critical area is in the suburbs, and there are, one of the target areas is moderates and independents, people who might vote Republican and could be switching from one election to another. Sheila, go ahead with your question.
Hi. Well, it's a more general question, not really about Philadelphia. Does Biden, as quite a conservative type, appeal to the type of Republican who's repelled by Trump's behavior, such as the, I think, senator we heard about who excoriated him? And would that make a significant number of such people actually vote for Biden?
So what's Biden's appeal among conservatives, and where are we looking at if that's the case? So let's, Dave, if you could take that one.
Okay, well, first off, Biden is by all measure a very, very centrist Democrat, although he was able to be vice president during a relatively progressive attempt at a presidency, but it really wasn't that successful in terms of a wider range of progressive issues. He's really considered quite mainstream. He's considered a moderate by almost everybody's definition. Many people who turned against Hillary Clinton truly thought she was a radical, simply a radical, left radical, much more inclined to upset things than
and what was that based on, Dave? Where does that stem from?
Oh, Meg, first of all, the Hillary antagonism goes all the way back to the 1980s, beginning when Bill was first just putting his foot out there to say I might run, not in 1992, but in 1988. And so the Bill Hillary partnership was something that was investigated. It was sensationalized. Everything that they ever did, whether it was in Arkansas or subsequent to Arkansas, was criticized. There was Hillary with regard to the healthcare reform, and after 1992, she was basically going to be a partner to the president and shepherd this all the way through. And then that mobilized the right tremendously against her. So the whole idea of moving towards healthcare reform, in that case, it would have been a more socialized form of healthcare. That probably branded her more than anything else. And then there were just the elevation of pseudo scandals, whether it was their failed Whitewater investments or other kinds of issues. She was either too left or too crooked. And all of those were the things that were elevated that just put her into a category that it was hard for her to redeem herself for a certain part of the population.
It's really Biden comes from exactly the same part of the party, if not more traditional in some ways.
Yeah, and I think to Sheila's point, the attraction of Biden to their constituency, she's asking about maybe more just that he's a kind of a decent man or perceived to be a decent guy. in a way that, Donald Trump isn't by his critics. So, it's not so much where he stands on, they're not necessarily parsing where he is on the political spectrum, but, they're just going, okay, this guy, there is an amount of people here who are exhausted by the Trump era, I think it's fair to say. And it was interesting, to actually, and Donald Trump will look at the numbers that both of his town hall and Joe Biden's dueling town halls, which took place simultaneously last night. And he'll look at those numbers. And it was interesting to see that Joe Biden pulled in more numbers. And as a split screen experience, if you jump between the two, it was extraordinary. You've got Donald Trump sort of leaning forward, sort of really ticked off most of the time, aggressive, sort of firing backwards and forwards with the moderator. And then you've got Joe Biden engaging these sort of long perambulations on policy, and it felt like another era. And I think that probably speaks to a bunch of people who are exhausted by this current moment. And the Dems are clearly trying to capitalize on it, because when I drove down here from my home in Virginia, I did see some massive signs on the side of the road. I think the words to the effect of "vote for decency," and these were Biden signs. So, I mean, that they're clearly trying to tap into that constituency and that sentiment with that kind of messaging.
Excellent. Well, thank you all very much indeed. The lights seem to be going or fading on Malcolm in downtown Philadelphia. Your lamp may be out too, yes. Thank you very much indeed, Malcolm Brown, for that, and also to Dave Swenson and to Anton, I think, who was roaming the streets of South Philly when we last saw him. Thank you very much indeed to Anton for joining us as well. Our next Insight is on Monday. You're all invited to join that. That's with Ryan Tyson, the pollster in Florida, and David Rancourt. That's at 5 p.m. BST. And then our next session here is on Thursday, and we will be in Fairfax County, and that's at 10 p.m. BST. So we're looking forward to seeing you all again online then. Until then, goodbye.